In 1962, there was a business hidden inside the drive-in theater that made more money than the movies themselves. Nobody talks about it. Not the historians, not the nostalgic blogs, not even the old-timers who actually worked there. You already know the drive-in was built on a simple idea: charge admission per car, show popular films under the stars, and people would come. What you don't know is that the real margin, the actual profit that made owners rich, didn't come from ticket sales at all. It came from what was sold inside those concession stands, and more specifically from a cost structure that was so asymmetrical it bordered on mathematical magic. Let me walk you through the real numbers, and I mean the real ones. Not the rounded versions that appear in nostalgic memoirs, but the actual costs that drive-in owners tracked in their ledgers. A typical suburban drive-in in 1962 could accommodate 400 to 600 vehicles. On a good Friday or Saturday night in the summer, you might fill 60 to 70% of those spots. That's 250 to 400 cars paying admission. The ticket price averaged 25 cents per person. And yes, per person. A family of 4 in one car paid $1. But here's what changed everything. The theater owner quickly realized that ticket revenue was almost entirely consumed by three expenses: the film rental fee, the property lease or mortgage, and the employee wages for projection and gate staff. Film rental, for instance, ate between 40 and 50% of ticket revenue. This was non-negotiable. The studios controlled the prints and negotiated aggressively with independent theater owners. A single film reel, 35mm heavy, valuable, was contractually yours to show only during a specified window, and the studio took their cut off the top before you saw a dime. The property itself, the land, the screen tower, the lot, the small building, represented the second major drain. Whether owned outright or mortgaged, the carrying cost was roughly 20 to 25% of gross ticket revenue. And then payroll. A drive-in typically employed 4 to 6 people per night during peak season: a gate attendant, a concession clerk, a projectionist, sometimes an assistant, and the owner themselves overseeing operations. At 1962 wages, roughly $1 an hour for entry-level workers, this could consume another 15 to 20% of ticket revenue. So the math looked like this: a 400-car night at 25 cents average per person, with 4 people per car, generated $4,000 in ticket revenue. After film rental, property costs, and payroll, you were left with maybe $2.00 to $3 in actual profit from admissions. Some nights, if attendance was soft or the film was unpopular, you lost money on tickets entirely. This is the moment where almost every drive-in owner faced a choice: close the business or figure out where real money could come from. And the ones who survived, the ones who built wealth from the drive-in, did something that seemed almost obvious in hindsight, but required a complete psychological shift in how they thought about the business. They stopped thinking about the drive-in as a theater and started thinking about it as a captive marketplace. The customers were trapped, not literally of course, but psychologically. They'd paid for admission, they'd driven there, their kids were in the car, they had 2 hours until the movie started and nowhere else to go. More importantly, they were already in a state of mind that said, "I'm willing to spend money tonight for entertainment." This is where the cost structure of concessions became almost unreasonably profitable. A large popcorn bucket cost the drive-in owner approximately 4 cents in bulk popcorn. Kernels were incredibly cheap, bought in 50-pound sacks, another cent for the cardboard bucket, and maybe half a cent for butter and salt. Total cost per large popcorn, 5.5 cents. The selling price was typically 35 cents. That's a markup of over 530%. A hot dog cost roughly 6 cents in hot dogs and buns bought wholesale, plus another 2 cents for mustard, onions, and napkins. Selling price, 25 cents. That's a 270% markup. Soft drinks were purchased at wholesale in syrup concentrate and carbonated water. The per-serving cost was maybe 3 cents. Selling price, 15 cents. A 400% markup. But here's where it becomes even more interesting. The real genius of drive-in concession economics wasn't just the markup. It was the volume created by captive demand, combined with the psychological effect of scarcity and convenience. You couldn't leave to get food elsewhere. Your options were buy from the stand or don't eat. This created what economists call an inelastic demand curve. Except drive-in owners didn't use that phrase. They just knew from experience that price didn't matter much. People came to spend money, and they spent it. A successful drive-in on a 400-car summer night could generate between $6.00 and $1.000 in concession revenue. The cost of goods sold on that revenue was rarely more than 20 to 25%. meaning the gross profit on concessions alone was $4.50 to $8.00. Compare that to the $2.00 to $3.00 in ticket profit, and suddenly you understand why the projector was secondary equipment. The real machinery of the drive-in was the concession stand. But there was a cost to managing this: spoilage, waste, and capital tied up in inventory. A drive-in had to stock for the peak night, Friday or Saturday in the middle of summer, which meant Tuesday and Wednesday nights. The inventory sat aging. Popcorn kernels could go stale. Hot dogs could expire. Candy could melt or become sticky in the summer heat. A poorly managed stand could lose 8 to 12% of its inventory to waste. The successful drive-in owners, the ones whose names you don't remember because they didn't become famous, but who actually accumulated real wealth, they solved this problem not through inventory management, but through psychological observation. They knew exactly which nights would be slow and which would be crushingly busy. They ordered accordingly. They knew which films would draw families, higher concession sales per capita because more kids, and which would draw teenagers, lower concession per capita but higher volume and faster turnover. They adjusted their staffing and inventory based on these patterns with the precision of someone reading a machine they understood completely. There was also a labor arbitrage that mattered enormously, though nobody called it that. A concession worker in 1962 earned about $1 to $1.25 per hour. A high school student or a housewife looking for part-time work would take those wages eagerly. The owner could staff the stand with 2 people for a 4-hour evening shift at a total labor cost of $8 to $1.00, and those 2 workers could easily generate $3.00 to $5.00 in gross revenue just by scooping popcorn and taking cash. The labor cost was something like 2 to 3% of that revenue. You cannot find that ratio in retail anywhere else. The drive-in owner understood, intuitively, from daily operations, what took economists decades to write papers about. The economics of a business depend entirely on what you're actually selling and to whom, not on the stated purpose of the enterprise. This created a fascinating second-order effect. Because concessions were so profitable, the drive-in owner had enormous flexibility in what they charged for admission, or whether they even bothered to fill the lot completely. Some owners, toward the end of the summer season when attendance naturally dropped, would actually lower admission prices to drive traffic, knowing that the real money was in the concession stand. A car that paid 50 cents instead of $1, but bought $3 worth of popcorn and hot dogs, was infinitely more valuable than an empty space. Some drive-in owners eventually stopped charging admission altogether during slow periods. They'd advertise free admission Tuesday through Thursday and nearly double their vehicle count on those nights, knowing the concession volume would more than compensate. The admission fee became irrelevant to the actual profit structure of the business. This is the angle that nobody tells you about drive-in economics in 1962. It wasn't a movie business. It was a food and beverage business that happened to use movies as the drawing mechanism. The moment an owner realized that, and it usually took them 3 to 6 months of actually running the numbers, everything about their strategy changed. The real architecture of a drive-in's profitability sat behind that concession window, and understanding it requires us to walk through the actual numbers, not the romantic version but the ledger version. Let's say our 1962 drive-in had achieved a solid middle position: 350 cars on an average Friday night, 200 cars on Wednesday, and 120 cars on a slow Tuesday. That's roughly 1,400 vehicles across a 6-night operating week. No Sunday matinees in this scenario. Most drive-ins kept Sundays dark because the profit margin on a daytime show simply didn't justify the labor cost and utilities. From those 1,400 cars, you could expect somewhere between 60 and 75% to purchase at least one concession item. That's not everyone buying. You had families who brought their own thermoses, their own snacks, teenagers who'd paid admission and had no money left, but you also had your repeat customers, your loyal base, who knew exactly what they wanted and bought without hesitation. So roughly 900 to 1.050 transactions across the week. Now, the average transaction value in 1962 was approximately $1.85 per vehicle. This included popcorn at 35 cents, a large fountain drink at 40 cents, candy at 25 to 35 cents per item, and hot dogs or other concession food items at 50 cents to $1. Some customers bought multiple items. Some bought nothing. That $1.85 average was conservative. Many drive-in owners, especially those in suburban areas or near military bases, reported much higher averages, sometimes pushing toward $2.25 per vehicle. But let's work with $1.85 for a realistic middle ground. 1.000 transactions times $1.85 equals $1.80 in gross concession revenue per week. Multiply that across 52 weeks, and you're looking at approximately $9.62 in annual concession revenue. For a modest, well-run drive-in 1962, that was the heartbeat of the operation. But revenue is only half the story. The concession cost structure is where most drive-in owners made their critical mistakes. Popcorn, for instance. A 50-pound bag of unpopped kernels cost approximately $3.50 in 1962. That bag, when popped, could fill roughly 140 large containers. The large container itself, the wax-coated paper cup with a lid, cost about 8 cents. Oil, salt, butter flavoring, and labor to pop and serve, another 10 to 12 cents per container. So your fully loaded cost per large popcorn was approximately 18 to 20 cents. You're selling it for 35 cents. Your margin is roughly 45 to 50% on popcorn. Fountain drinks were higher margin. A 5-gallon bag of syrup cost roughly $8 to $1.00 and could produce approximately 100 fountain drinks when mixed with carbonated water at the proper ratio. So syrup cost per drink 8 to 10 cents. The cup, lid, straw, and napkin, roughly 5 to 6 cents. Ice, negligible in cost. You're selling the drink for 40 cents. Your gross margin on a large fountain drink was approximately 55 to 60%. Hot dogs were trickier because you had more moving parts. A case of hot dogs, 50 count, ran about $4.50. A package of buns was roughly 60 cents for 24 buns, condiments, napkins, and labor to grill, assemble, and package, another 15 to 20 cents per unit. Total cost per hot dog, around 35 cents. You were selling them for 65 cents to 85 cents depending on toppings and location. Margin, 35 to 50%. But here's the catch. Hot dogs required more labor than popcorn or drinks, and they had a shorter shelf life. You couldn't sell yesterday's hot dog. If you grilled 40 hot dogs on a Tuesday night and only sold 20, you ate that loss. Most drive-in owners learned quickly to treat hot dogs as a specialty item, something you made to order or in small batches, not in volume. The ones who made hot dogs in bulk and hoped to sell them were the ones who ended up discounting them at 9 p.m. to move inventory, which destroyed that 35 to 50% margin you'd calculated. Candy had the highest margins of all. A box of assorted candy, chocolate bars, licorice, hard candies, mints, cost roughly $8 and contained 50 individual items. Cost per unit, 16 cents. Sell price, 25 to 35 cents. Margin, 50 to 75%. And the beauty of candy, it didn't spoil, it required zero labor to prepare, and it took up minimal space. Smart drive-in owners aggressively pushed candy because it was pure profit with no complexity. Now let's consolidate. In an average week with 1.000 concession transactions, a well-managed drive-in might break down as follows: 400 popcorns at 35 cents, 350 fountain drinks at 40 cents, 150 hot dogs at 75 cents average, and 100 candy items at 30 cents average. Popcorn revenue, $1.40. Popcorn cost, $3.06. Profit, $1.04. Fountain drink revenue, $1.40. Fountain drink cost, $3.05. Profit, $1.05. Hot dog revenue, $1.1250. Hot dog cost, $5.250. Profit, $6.00. Candy revenue, $3.00. Candy cost, $1.06. Profit, $1.04. Total weekly concession profit, $2.83. $83 per week in concession profit. That's $1.04.71 per year. But wait, we haven't accounted for the admission fees yet. Remember, 1.400 vehicles per week. Average admission fee, 75 cents per vehicle. That's $1.450 in raw admission revenue per week, or $5.4600 annually. But let's subtract the costs associated with collecting that revenue. The ticket booth operator, roughly $2.05 per night, or $1.50 per week. Parking lot attendants if you had them. And the physical infrastructure of maintaining the booth itself. Paint, repairs, supplies. Call it $2.00 per week in direct admission collection costs. That brings your net admission revenue to roughly $8.54, $4.20 annually. So now we're looking at concession profit. $1 4.716 per year. Net admission profit, $4 4.20 per year. Total gross operating profit, $5 8.916 per year. But this is before you've paid for your film rental, your utilities, your property taxes, your insurance, your equipment maintenance, your advertising, and your full-time staff salaries. Here's where the second major misconception about drive-in economics lived. Most people thought the film rental was the biggest expense. It wasn't. Film rental in 1962 typically ran 35 to 50% of box office revenue. So if your admissions brought in $5 4.600, you'd pay the film studios somewhere between $1 9.110 and $2 730 per year in rental fees. That was substantial, but it wasn't a flat fee. It moved with your business. More cars meant higher fees, but also more revenue. The math stayed roughly proportional. What actually killed drive-in margins were the fixed costs, the ones that existed whether you had 50 cars or 500 cars on a given night. Property taxes on a drive-in lot were significantly higher than taxes on most small businesses, because the land value itself was substantial. A 5-acre drive-in lot in a suburban area, depending on location and local assessment practices, could carry annual property taxes ranging from $2 to $5.00. In some high-value markets, it was much higher. Then there was insurance. A drive-in operator needed liability coverage for customer injuries, property damage, fire, theft, and weather. Annual insurance premiums in 1962 typically ran $1 to $3.000 mornin per year for a medium-sized drive-in. Some operators paid more if they'd had claims or operated in high-risk areas. Utilities: electricity for lighting the lot, powering the projection booth, running the concession equipment and refrigeration, heating water for hot dogs and coffee, ran roughly $1.50 to $2.00 per month. That's $1.00. This was a major cost that absolutely scaled with operating days and hours. Advertising and promotion, newspaper ads, radio spots, community sponsorships, and maintenance of the outdoor marquee signage typically consumed 5 to 8% of gross revenue. For a drive-in doing roughly $1.000 in total gross revenue, that meant $5 to $8 per year in advertising spend. Many owners learned this the hard way. If you didn't advertise, your customer count dropped, and your overall revenue declined faster than you'd saved on advertising costs. Maintenance and repairs, parking lot patching, fence repair, projection equipment maintenance, concession equipment repairs, painting, landscaping was the category that tripped up most first-time drive-in owners. They'd budget for it, allocate 2 or 3% of revenue, and then the projection lamp would burn out. Replacement $3.000, or the roof would leak over the concession stand, $8.00 repair, or the parking lot would develop a pothole, $5.00 patch job. Suddenly you're at 6 or 7% of revenue, and you're pulling from your cushion. A realistic maintenance budget for an established drive-in, accounting for both routine and unexpected repairs, was probably 5 to 7% of annual gross revenue. On a $1.000 revenue base, that's $5 to $7.000 per year. Then came staffing. Most drive-ins operated with a lean crew, but they couldn't do it alone. A typical night required 1 projector operator, often the owner on slow nights, 1 or 2 concession workers, 1 ticket booth operator, optionally 1 parking lot attendant if the lot was large or the crowd was rough. That's a minimum of 3 people per night, more realistically 4 or 5. Even at modest wages, $1.50 to $2.50 per hour in 1962 across a 6-night operating week, you're looking at significant labor costs. Let's say you paid projector operator $1.05 per night, $9.00 per week. 2 concession workers, $1.00 per night each, $1.20 per week. Ticket operator, $8 per night, $4.08 per week. Manager or owner operating 1 or 2 nights, $0, but replacement labor on other nights, $8.00 per week. That's $3.38 per week in direct labor, or roughly $1.7.576 per year. And this assumes no benefits, no payroll taxes, and that your owner was willing to work several nights per week themselves. Now let's build a full expense picture for our hypothetical 1962 drive-in. Gross revenue, admissions plus concessions, $9 6.200 plus $5 4.600 equals $1 50.800. Film rental 40% of admissions, $2 1.840 property taxes, $3 500 insurance, $2.000 utilities, $2.100 advertising, $6.500 maintenance and repairs, $7.000 labor, $1.7.576. Total direct operating expenses, $6.0.516. Gross operating profit, $1.50.800 minus $6.0.516. But wait. That $9.0.284 is before debt service, depreciation, and the owner's tax burden. Most drive-in operators didn't own their land outright. They either rented the property or had financed the purchase. If you'd financed a drive-in property at, say, $4.0.000 to $6.0.000, the land, the building, the equipment, you'd be carrying a mortgage or land contract. Interest and principal on that debt could easily consume $3 to $6.000 per year, and the IRS didn't let you deduct your $9.0.284 as is. The building, the equipment, the vehicles, all of it depreciated. After properly accounting for depreciation, many drive-in owners found their taxable income was significantly lower than their cash flow suggested. This wasn't a bad thing, it meant lower taxes. But it also meant that the beautiful $9.0.284 profit figure wasn't all theirs to keep. A drive-in owner with a $5.0.000 mortgage and standard depreciation might end up with a real taxable income of $6 to $7 and after federal and state taxes, which could run 20 to 35% depending on the state and the era, they'd net somewhere in the $4 to $5.0.00 range as actual take-home profit. That was excellent money in 1962. The median household income in America that year was roughly $5,500. A successful drive-in owner was pulling down 7 to 10 times the median income. But the math only worked if you managed the variables correctly. If your vehicle count dropped from 1.400 per week to 900 per week, something that could happen in a slow season or if a competitor opened nearby, your entire profit structure shifted. Your revenue dropped 36%, but your fixed costs stayed nearly the same. Suddenly that $5.0.000 profit became $2.0.000. And if the slide continued, it could become nothing. This is why drive-in ownership was such a fragile enterprise. It looked from the outside like a license to print money, get people in the lot, sell them popcorn, and take 35 to 50% margins. But the machinery underneath was delicate, and one major miscalculation, or worse, one external shock, could shatter it. The real economics of the drive-in didn't exist in the dreams of romantic nostalgia. They existed in the spreadsheets, the vendor invoices, the payroll records, and the very specific understanding that you were not running a movie theater. You were running a food and beverage operation that happened to use motion pictures as your loss leader, the thing you ran at a loss or thin margin to draw the customers whose actual job was to buy $1.85 worth of snacks while sitting in a metal chair in an open field. End Part 2 Transition Point. Continue naturally from here into Part 3 without conclusion. And that realization, that uncomfortable but entirely accurate realization, is what separated the owners who survived the 1970s from those who didn't. Because once you accept that the movie is not your product, everything changes. Your margin structure changes, your staffing model changes, your building maintenance changes, you're thinking about weather, about seasonality, about the customer relationship itself, all of it shifts. A drive-in that tried to make money on tickets alone was a drive-in that was already failing. It just didn't know it yet. So let's talk about what actually happened to these places. Because by 1975, just 10 years after that profitable 1962 summer we started with, the economics had already begun to fracture. The first fracture was labor. In 1962, a concession stand worker made about $1.15 an hour, maybe $1.35 if they were experienced. By 1973, minimum wage had climbed to $1.60. By 1975, it was $2.10. That's an 82% increase in a single decade. The drive-in owner who had budgeted his margin structure in 1962 was now bleeding money through his concession stand. But there was a second fracture, quieter and more insidious. Television was no longer a novelty by the mid-1970s. It was everywhere. And color television, affordable color television, had changed the entire equation of how Americans spent their leisure time. In 1962, if you wanted to watch a movie, you had three choices: go to a regular movie theater downtown, rent a projector and film and host a home viewing with friends, or drive to the drive-in. By 1974, you had a fourth choice: wait 6 months to a year and watch it on television, at home, in color, in climate control, without paying for gas or snacks. And that fourth choice, that invisible fourth competitor, was one the drive-in owner couldn't fight with marketing or pricing strategy. He could only fight it by accepting that his market was shrinking and his business model was built on a market size that no longer existed. The third fracture was environmental. Drive-in owners had always accepted weather as a fact of business. A night with clouds might lose 15% of customers. A rainy night might lose 40%. But starting in the early 1970s, something new happened. Suburban sprawl met environmental regulation. A drive-in that had sat on the edge of town in 1955, with unobstructed sky above and farmland around it, was by 1975 surrounded by residential neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods had noise ordinances, they had light pollution complaints, they had families who didn't appreciate the sounds of car horns and loud dialogue bleeding into their backyards at 11 o'clock at night. The drive-in owner couldn't move the drive-in. It was built on land that was now worth more for residential development than for drive-in operation. So instead, he faced increasing pressure to reduce volume, reduce hours, and accept that his peak season was shrinking. By 1978, the average drive-in was operating at maybe 45% of its 1962 capacity on a given night. That meant that vendor costs, which were largely fixed, because you needed to stock the concession stand before you knew how many customers would show up, were now spread across fewer transactions. Your cost per popcorn container went up even though the price you charged stayed roughly the same. The owner faced a simple choice: raise prices aggressively and watch attendance fall further, or accept a narrowing margin. Most chose the margin compression, and that was the slow death. By the early 1980s, the drive-in movie theater had become less a symbol of American leisure and more a symbol of economic stubbornness, a business that refused to die but couldn't quite live. Some owners adapted. They converted their drive-ins into flea markets on weekends. They rented the parking lot for outdoor concerts or classic car shows. They held summer movie series but charged admission separately from concessions, basically reverting to a regular outdoor movie theater model, which actually had lower margins but more predictable attendance because it was event-based rather than open-ended. A very small few, found a niche. Rural drive-ins, far from television signals and suburban development, kept running. A drive-in in Nebraska or Montana, serving a county where the next movie theater was 40 miles away, could keep operating on thin margins because there genuinely was no competitor. The customer had no fourth choice. But those were exceptions. The modal drive-in, the suburban or exurban theater that had thrived in the 1960s, was gone by 1985. Not all of them were physically demolished. Some still stood, their screens faded, their parking lots cracked, their marquees dark except for weekend flea market signs. What killed the drive-in was not a single catastrophic event. It was not the rise of multiplexes, though that mattered. It was not the invention of VCRs, though that mattered too. It was the slow, compounding realization that the economics which had once been favorable had, through a combination of wage inflation, demographic shifts, regulatory changes, and new technology, become untenable. An owner in 1962 could operate on margins of 8 to 12% because his cost structure was stable and his market was growing. An owner in 1978 faced the same basic cost structure but a shrinking market and rising wages. The math simply didn't work anymore. And yet, and this is important, there is a strange epilogue to this story. Starting around 2015, something unexpected began to happen. Drive-in movie theaters began to reopen. Not many, not in the suburbs, but in rural areas, in tourist destinations, in small towns that had always kept one running, new owners began to appear. Young entrepreneurs, people who had grown up watching YouTube videos of drive-ins, who saw the experience not as a movie delivery system but as an experience product. These new drive-ins operated on completely different economics. They charged higher admission, sometimes $1.2 to $1.5 per car, not $2. They carefully controlled concession pricing, often charging what regular movie theaters charged, because they understood they could get away with it because the experience itself had value. They didn't try to operate every night, they operated on weekends, and maybe one weeknight during summer. They hosted special events, drive-in church services, car shows, classic movie marathons. In other words, they had stopped trying to be movie theaters that served food. They had become experience venues that screened movies. And these new drive-ins are profitable, not because they've discovered some secret that the 1960s owners missed, but because they've accepted completely different financial inputs. A 1960s drive-in owner wanted volume. He wanted 400 cars a night, every night, because that's how he made his 12% margin work. A 2020s drive-in owner wants 200 cars on a Friday night at a higher admission price, at a higher concession price, with much lower labor costs because he's using a skeleton crew and higher technology. He's okay with 50 operating nights per year instead of 150 because his per-night economics are radically different. The modern drive-in has higher fixed costs per operating night, better projection equipment, better sound, better lot maintenance, but much lower labor costs as a percentage of revenue because customers spend money on an experience, not on watching a movie cheaply. It's not nostalgia that's keeping these places alive. It's better economics than the original model ever had. And that is the real financial story of the drive-in theater. It wasn't killed by outside forces. It was killed by the simple economic fact that the margins that had once seemed reasonable, 8 to 12%, became impossible to achieve when the cost structure changed and the addressable market shrank. The owners of those theaters in the 1970s weren't stupid. They weren't slow to adapt. They were operating in an environment where no amount of cleverness could overcome the math. And the ones that survived, and the new ones that have emerged, have done so by accepting that they're not in the movie rental business anymore. They never were. The 1960s owners just didn't fully understand what business they were actually in. Thank you for walking through these numbers with me, for taking the time to understand not just what drive-in theaters were, but how they actually worked financially. If you found yourself thinking about the economics of other forgotten American institutions, the small-town newspapers, the department store empires, the local radio stations that once defined entire communities, then please subscribe. Hit the bell so you never miss a new video. And I hope you'll be back, because there are so many more ledgers waiting to be